right. So, questions from last week. How can one explain when a country is majority Christian but still retains collectivist values? 2 parts to my answer. Part 1. Religious identity can change really, really quickly. Culture only ever changes very, very slowly. According to the China Historical Christian Database maintained by Boston University, when I was in college, not that long ago, there were in China about 1 million Christians. Today, 100 million. That's a big difference in a few years. Culture changes very slowly. People grow up with habits. People hand down traditions. So, that's part of my explanation. The other part of my answer is I named this class very carefully. This class is named How Christianity Helps Explain the Way Westerners Communicate. It's not named Why Christianity Explains Everything about the difference between Western and Eastern communication. It's an influence, and I think it's a powerful influence. But there are other influences. Question number 2. Does, and if so how, does Christianity affect Japanese culture and society? My answer, minimally. Very, very small. About as much as Hinduism influences the culture of the United States. And that's not me making a silly joke. The number of Christians in Japan is about 0.5% of the population. That's about the percent of Hindus in the United States. I have had Hindu students, but the influence on the overall culture is barely detectable, if at all. Every other country that Christianity has reached, it's become a much bigger percentage of the population. We've mentioned China already. South Korea, it's about 20% of the population. But Japan, 0.5%. Now, there are some whispers about little things. Tea ceremony, for example. Senno Rikyu, the father of tea ceremony, had students who were Christians, lived in a community where there were Christians, and there is a Christian practice, communion. Christians will eat ceremonial bread and drink wine together, and they will meditate on togetherness as fellow believers in Jesus. And it's interesting, some of the similarities to tea ceremony. And a picture that will only load slowly because of the Wi-Fi. In communion, you hold the cup of wine up to the height of your head to show respect, just like in tea ceremony. You take a white cloth and you wipe afterward to make it clean, just like in tea ceremony. Some have said there's a resemblance between the only halfway loaded wagashi and the bread that is taken at communion. I don't know. That's something that some people want to believe. They find the similarities striking. It's also true that the Emperor Emeritus, the woman he married, the Empress Emerita, she was raised Catholic. And there are whispers, there is gossip, that there was a Catholic influence in that household. But that's gossip. I will stick to my answer that the Christian influence on Japanese culture is very, very small and mild. Third question. What are the differences or similarities in impersonal and interpersonal groups with how the neighbor is viewed? How is neighbor defined? I'm still thinking about this question. I don't have a simple answer. I have a few observations. Let me share them with you. The literal meaning of neighbor in English is just the person closest to you. In a public gathering like this, I might say, turn to your neighbor, and people would just turn to the person sitting beside them. The literal meaning is wherever you live, in your house or your apartment, the person right beside you. If we think of neighbors, if we think of the word a little more loosely, then with interpersonal groups, the people you know are the people you have obligations to, the people you've been introduced to, and the relationship is formal. I mentioned at the first class meeting, I taught this class at Tokyo Gaidai as an intensive 1 week. We got to discussing this subject, and one Japanese, actually two students, one Japanese, one from Italy, they talked about how it's common for Japanese students or Japanese young adults to keep friend groups separate. That what you might see in the United States or in Italy, you might meet someone and say, come along, a bunch of my friends are getting together, you can meet them, we'll all go have fun. But more commonly, with Japanese young adults, it would be, well, why don't you and I go do something in about 2 weeks? Today, I'm meeting with this group of friends. Next week, I'll see this group of friends, and the groups are kept separate. In communities governed by impersonal pro-sociality, in-groups and out-groups are a lot more loose, and there's a lot more live and let live. You might notice what your neighbors are doing, but there is a strong expectation that you don't interfere. I did not know until very recently, until I came here, I had never heard about the Gonin Gumi tradition and about 5 households who were all held responsible if anyone in any of those 5 households broke the law. Now, where that is one of the roots of the culture, that is going to shape how neighbors relate to each other. And I have repeatedly heard it described to me that in Japan, you pay careful attention to what the neighbors think. And if you do something, and it can be observed by the neighbors, and the neighbors might not approve, that's a strong reason not to do it. In the United States, I have heard it said as a joke, oh, what will the neighbors think? And we think it's funny. And we think it's even funnier to shock the neighbors. So, I don't have an easy answer to that. The drift of my answer is, in groups, in cultures that are more individualist, your neighbors have less influence. You have fewer obligations to them. It's easier to be kind to them because it's less complicated. We will, I think, 3 weeks from now, the day we talk about friendship and relational mobility, we will return to this issue. Question number, 4. Why has religion become a major force in political or interpersonal relations? Religions make truth claims about the world. Religions make claims about what the meaning and purpose of life is. That's going to come up in what we talk about today. Religions make claims about what is right and wrong, and where does right and wrong come from. And I can say, from researching and teaching relationship development, there's something we like to say that opposites attract. That very different people could date, could get married, and be a wonderful couple who love each other. That can be true when you are talking about things like hobbies, like resources. A rich person and a poor person can make a great husband and wife. But what the research shows is if you are opposites on big questions like what is right and wrong, what do you want out of life, how do you want to raise children, those relationships don't work. So, why is religion a big force? Because it offers binding answers to questions about things like that. And those make a big difference in whether or not relationships succeed. One more thing I'll say, a lot of religions have very strong teachings about whether you should marry someone outside of your faith. Judaism, strong teaching, you should only marry another observant Jewish person. Christianity does not have an explicit teaching about that, but it is often taught to Christian young adults that it's very unwise to date and marry someone who is not your fellow Christian. Fifth question, I think. How do individualism and collectivism differ in terms of their values, beliefs, and impact on society? I wish I could give you a better answer to this one. My answer is going to sound like a cop-out, like I'm taking the easy way out or being lazy. The categories of individualist and collectivist culture are so broad that you almost can't find things that are consistent in each category. Japan is a very collectivist culture. So is Guatemala. As a matter of fact, Guatemala, by the data, is the most collectivist culture. The shared beliefs between Japan and Guatemala, there aren't very many. Nobody in Guatemala, I don't think, practices Shinto. They don't think that blood type predicts personality. The United States and Sweden both measure very, very individualist. And in the United States, things like welfare and food assistance are very controversial. And a lot of people are skeptical of them and think you should be able to pay your own way and feed yourself. But in Sweden, they have very, very powerful social programs. Their explanation of it is those enable each individual to pursue what they want to do because they're not afraid of not having enough to eat or being able to pay their bills. Both individualist cultures, very different values. So because those are broad categories, generalizing would be like saying, what values do the human race share in common? And the answer is almost none. All right. If Christianity promotes individualism, then why do Christians risk their life for the community and fight the Crusades' war? First part of my answer to that. Individuals can still be persuaded. We will eventually talk about how do you persuade, or what are the differences in how you persuade people in Japan and other collectivist cultures? And how do you persuade people in the United States and other individualist cultures about psychological reactance and about group-based, norm-based appeals? And the Crusades, those were described as fighting in defense of the will of God. So if you fought in the Crusades, that meant God would be pleased with you and God would reward you. And that was very persuasive. It's also the case that war is a great way to win, to become famous, to become a hero. Countries with individualist cultures are not slower to go to war. People in individualist cultures love to go down in history for how brave they were and how many medals they won, and war is a great opportunity. Okay, a question that I am just starting to realize I really need to think more about. How does a collectivist society approach Christianity in comparison to that of an individualist society? The interesting thing is what we talked about last week, what the Catholic Church enforced as a rule. That rule was not, they didn't adopt the rule until 400 years after Jesus ascended, until 400 years after the end of the Bible. And actually, what is described in the Bible, the life of Jesus, happened in Jerusalem and nearby in the surrounding countryside in about 5 BCE to about the year 30. And that was a very, very collectivist culture. So the whole community depicted in the Bible was very collectivist. Central and South America, very Christian, very collectivist. Africa, Africa is somewhat divided between Christians and Muslims. There are about 500 million Muslims in Africa and about 700 million Christians. And Africa is very collectivist. So I first thought about this thinking, well, Christian teaching and collectivist culture are very, very compatible. It's where Christianity came from, and it's very widespread in collectivist cultures today. But how do they do it differently? I think about all I can say, there are a lot of Christian teachings that say, don't be selfish, limit how much you make your life about your own ambition. That gets to what we're going to talk about today. But there are also a whole lot of Christian teachings about extend your care and your mercy and your compassion beyond the people you know. Jesus preached a sermon called the Sermon on the Mount. He was standing on a mountainside so the crowd could hear him. And one of the things he said in that sermon was, if you are only kind to the people who are kind to you, how are you any different from the pagans? And if you only greet the people who greet you, how are you any different from people who are wicked? And that is a teaching that would go right to the heart of interpersonal pro-sociality. I have time, barely, for what I think is the most interesting question of all. I wish it had been voted a little higher. If the woman did not touch Jesus, would he have helped her? Well, on another occasion, a man with leprosy came to him and said, if you are willing, I can be healed. And it says, Jesus said, I am willing, be healed. And he stepped forward and touched the man with leprosy. Now back then, you did not touch people with leprosy. Modern medicine did not exist. Touching someone with leprosy was a death sentence. So if this woman, not part of his family, made ceremonially unclean because she was bleeding, if he would touch someone with leprosy, I think he would have been willing to touch her. The stakes were a lot lower. All right. It is 1:40. That is our 20 minutes on last week's questions. So let me jump out of here real quick and ask you to get in your groups. Group 1 over here, Group 9 back there. If you'll sit with your groups, introduce yourselves to each other. In 5 minutes at 1:45, we will resume with today's topic. Go. Much as I hate to cut it off while it looks like you're having fun, it is 1:45 and we have got to get on to the new things we are going to talk about today. We are going to talk today about the difference between the United States and Japan in self-concept. Now, last week, when we were talking about Joseph Henrich's argument, in some of the conversation, I admitted, Henrich's argument is not that good of a fit to Japan. Japan is a collectivist culture. And if you read Henrich's articles and his book, you'll see his explanation, he thinks, covers collectivist culture and individualist culture worldwide. But his explanation depends on extended clans, and extended clans are not a very Japanese thing. So the fit of that explanation to this country is not perfect. Now, I say that to say, this week we are talking about self-construal. We are talking about the work of Kitayama Shinobu and Hazel Marcus. He started his career at Hokkaido University. He then taught at the University of Oregon. And when he was there, his office was about a 10-minute walk from mine. He's now at the University of Michigan. She is a professor at Stanford. All of their work is comparing the United States to Japan. So the wobbly fit we had last week does not apply this week. To begin with, self-concept is a major issue in understanding communication. There are a few reasons why. How you think of yourself will dictate what do you feel competent to talk about, to approach other people, to interact about. You may think, I don't know anything about sports. I am not good at being funny. I do not necessarily understand the opposite sex. All of those would be issues tied to your self-concept, and they would make a difference in whether you talked at all. It's also true, our self-concept makes a big difference in who we are attracted to, romantically, just for friendship, even just for coworkers that we want to seek out and work with. The dominant theory of attraction right now is self-expansion theory, that we are most attracted to people who make our own sense of self larger, and that we tend to move out of relationships when other people are no longer expanding our sense of self. A third application of this is when we deal with conflict. We will eventually, in here, talk about face negotiation theory, which is the dominant model of how conflict behavior differs between the United States and Japan, and it begins from the work of Kitayama and Marcus. So, this is something that is very basic to communication. They call their theory self-construal. Now that word is a very unusual, kind of obscure English word. Most native speakers couldn't define it without looking it up. Here's what it means. To take information that seems disorganized and to explain it in a way that gives it meaning. Let me give you 2 examples, and then I'll define this phrase. You might go to the doctor with a bunch of symptoms. The doctor might be confused and order some tests. The doctor might have all these test results and all the symptoms and think, and then all of a sudden, they diagnose you. They know what it is. And the diagnosis explains the symptoms and it explains the test results. They construed all that information and now it's meaningful. Another example, a crime happens, a violent crime. Police officers come and collect evidence. And the detective looks at all of the evidence and she develops a theory of the crime and names a suspect. She took all that disorganized information and construed it. So, self-construal. How do you take all the accurate statements that could be made about you, and how do you arrive at a meaningful self? How do you say, I am, and finish that sentence? Now, I'm about to ask a very easy question, I think. Kitayama and Marcus say there are 2 dominant types of self-construal, interdependent and independent. Now think back to last week, to our discussion of collective and individualist cultures. Which of those do you think they said is more common in Japan? Interdependent, yes. Easiest question of the semester. Interdependent self-construal is a lot more common in Japan, and independent self-construal is what you tend to find in the United States. Now, to get to the differences, we are going to take a few minutes on each of 6 places you can find difference. How people answer the question, who am I? People with interdependent self-construal do it differently from people whose self-construal is independent. How is emotion different between people with both types of self-construal? How important is it that your behavior be consistent? What is the essence of self-esteem? What is self-esteem? What is the source of self-esteem? Where does it come from? And finally, what is the nature of relationships? How do relationships fit into your everyday life? Now, to do this, we'll look at each of them and put the differences where they go. So to begin with, how do people with each type of self answer the question, who am I? People with an interdependent self-construal, they get who am I from their relationships. They're likely to answer that question, I am a daughter, I am a friend, I am my boss's assistant. When they are asked that, the describing words that come out of their mouth are much more likely to identify relationships. They also are more likely to name group memberships. I am in a club. I am on a team. I graduated from Tokyo International University. I am from, here is the name of my town. People with an independent self-construal are more likely to answer that question with traits, stable traits about their personality. I am shy. I am outgoing. I am ambitious. I am stubborn. They are also likely to answer that question with distinctions, words that show how they are different from, better than, worse than, stronger than, weaker than other people. I am a straight A student. Well, if you're a straight A student, you may be implying you're a better student than other people. I'm very creative. Compared to who? Compared to less creative people. So it's about showing how you're different, not necessarily how you fit in. In a 2001 study, Hazel Marcus, with two other collaborators, they recruited participants from the United States and participants from Japan. And this is how they did the study. They gave them a full sheet of lined paper and asked the question, "Who are you?" and then ran a timer for 45 seconds and asked the participant to just write for 45 seconds. When they were done, they gave the participant a second sheet of paper and started the clock again with the same question, "Who are you?" And they did that 20 times. So they wound up with 20 sheets of paper where they had written answers to the question, "Who are you?" One creative thing that they did with both groups, American participants and Japanese participants, is some of the participants they had sit in a room by themselves. And the question, "Who are you?" was recorded. Some filled it out in a setting like this, where there was a big crowd. Some sat in a room with just one other participant and they read the question to each other, back and forth, just the two of them. And some sat in the researcher's office and the researcher, dressed up like a professor, asked the question. And the first finding that Marcus and her collaborators reported was the Americans across all four settings gave very similar answers. The Japanese participants across the four settings gave very different answers. So when you moved them into different relational contexts, by yourself, in a group, with a peer, with someone higher in status, the answers changed. They also reported Americans said a lot more. They were a lot more likely to fill the page, and their answers had more to do with their psychology. The Japanese participants wrote about their physical traits. I am tall. I have curly hair. Their abilities. I play piano. I have high grades in math. So the second difference between the different self-construals is the importance of consistent and predictable behavior. If your behavior stays the same no matter where you are, for people with an interdependent self-construal, that's immature. Immature and inflexible, because you're not adapting to the needs of the group. But where self-construal is more commonly independent, behaving consistently and predictably is mature. It shows integrity. In the United States, it's a fairly big compliment to say about someone, with them, what you see is what you get. They are the same with their family as they are at their job. And it's an insult, or at least criticism, to say that they are two-faced. Two-faced means get them with one group of people, they'll behave this way. Get them with another group, they'll behave a completely different way. Now, I have to say, anytime we talk about cultural difference, we are not talking about they are or they aren't, it is or it isn't. We're talking about a difference in emphasis. What's more likely and less likely. Not yes, no, but more or less. For example, I happen to know that in the United States, there are judges who go to work every day in a courtroom, and they go home every night, and they are the mother to a 3-year-old. The person I just mentioned is a friend of mine, actually, and I know she does not talk to her 3-year-old the way she talks to murderers in her courtroom. So it is true that some adaptation to who you're talking about happens everywhere. And it is also true that where self-construal is interdependent, there is still an expectation that you'll be honest, that you'll be dependable. It's a different expectation with a different strength to it. A 2020 study by a couple of psychologists at the University of Georgia named Haas and Van Dellen. They did something, they recruited participants from the United States and from Japan. They gave them the sheet of paper and said, "Who are you?" They also asked the participants to fill out several instruments that measured their well-being, psychological well-being. So questionnaires measuring, are you depressed? Do you have anxiety? Are you satisfied with your life? Are you lonely? They did a number of these. Then they thanked the participants for coming in, and 4 years later, invited them back, had them do the same thing. Write out, who are you? And then do the same stack of measures of psychological well-being. Here is what they found. For both Japanese and American participants, some of them, 4 years later, had not changed. What they wrote was pretty much the same as 4 years earlier. But in both groups of participants, some people had changed. The second time they wrote who they were, they had changed a lot. And the interesting finding of the study was, for the Americans who had changed a lot, those measures of psychological well-being were very negative. It was very, very traumatic if their self-concept had changed. They were a lot more likely to be very unhappy, suffering from depression, not satisfied with their life. But the Japanese participants whose self-concept had changed, their psychological well-being was nice and high. You respond to the group you happen to be with. That brings us then to emotions. For people with an interdependent self-construal, the research shows emotions mostly operate as signals of closeness. You experience when you interact with other people, I feel close to this person, I feel fond of this person and I are getting along, this person is irritated with me, this person and I have drifted apart. Emotions also are controllable. For the needs of the group, you can put your emotions on hold. You can show the emotional display that other people need. Where self-construal is independent, emotions are understood as internal sensations. They are not that much about closeness or distance, compatibility with other people. And emotions, suppressing them is fake. And it's also unhealthy. They refer to it as bottling up your emotions. And an honest person shows their emotions. And if you like other people and feel close to them, you will share your real emotions. Now, once again, this is not a matter of yes or no, it's a matter of emphasis. People in individualist cultures with an independent self-construal, sometimes they notice they're getting along with other people or they aren't. And people with an interdependent self-construal, they feel disappointed, angry, afraid, sad. Nobody's saying these don't exist for the other category. But what the research shows is what you more commonly pay attention to and more commonly act upon, people with an interdependent self-construal more commonly notice and act upon level of closeness. And people with an independent self-construal more frequently notice and act upon their internal emotional sensations. All right. Bringing us then to what is self-esteem? What's the nature of self-esteem? This time I'm going to take it backward and start with the people with the independent self-construal. You remember last week we talked about the weird problem with social science research, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. It is in textbooks, a whole generation of textbooks, that positive self-esteem is a basic human drive. Everybody directs their thinking toward things that make you feel good about yourself. We have put ink on pages saying, where there are human beings, you will find that. Kitayama and Marcus first started getting attention for their research when they said, that's not true. It is not a basic human drive, and it is not true everywhere. One other detail, too low self-esteem, it's almost like you're bleeding. Low self-esteem has to be addressed immediately. You have to help people if they have low self-esteem. Because if their self-esteem is low, soon they will start doing self-destructive things. But what Kitayama and Marcus reported, I think Kitayama had to bring this up, Ki ga sumanai, the incomplete self, and Hansei, self-reflection, targeting errors and failures. What they found in their data collection with their Japanese participants was that they were more likely to think about their weaknesses, to think about negative things about them, and the more they thought about it, they thought that enabled a process of continuous improvement, and that continuous improvement was important, that it was their responsibility to the group. Kitayama and Marcus in 1997 did a study, and in this they established what Americans do that's the mirror image of Ki ga sumanai and Hansei. They named it self-enhancement. The things that Americans think of as strengths, we rank ourselves more highly than we should, and we think they are more rare than they actually are. So an American who maybe has built his identity on what a good singer he is likely to rate his singing ability as good enough to get him a professional career, when actually, let people who work for music companies listen to this person, they might say, probably not professional quality. And that person is also likely to say most people can't sing, when actually most people can carry a tune just fine. Those processes happen with self-enhancement. What Kitayama and Marcus did in that study, I found very striking. They asked American students and Japanese students, write down all the recent events you can remember where your self-esteem either went up or it went down. They collected all of them, and then they made little short paragraphs with the identifying information removed. They also knew, the researchers did, whether an American student had contributed the story or a Japanese student. They wound up with 400 of them. Then they took participants from both the United States and Japan and asked them to read all 400. And after each one, they were asked, if this happened to you, would it change your self-esteem? Would it go up or down? And would it be, scale of 1 to 10, a big change or a small change? The American participants picked more of the paragraphs that would make their self-esteem go up. And when they picked the ones that made it go up, they always gave it a higher score. And the ones they picked that would make it go up were almost always stories that other Americans had submitted. All the findings were mirror image for the Japanese participants. They were more likely to pick the ones that made it go down. They gave a stronger, higher score to the ones that made it go down. And the ones they picked were more likely to be the ones that had been contributed by Japanese students in the first place. The one other interesting wrinkle to this, some of the participants in this study were Japanese students studying in the United States. And they still had all three of those effects. They chose negative, they gave a higher score, and they chose stories contributed by Japanese people, but in each case the effect was weaker than Japanese students studying in Japan. All right, that is the essence of self-esteem. Where does self-esteem come from? For people with an interdependent self-construal, self-esteem comes from belonging and fitting in. When you know that you belong, that you are embraced and accepted by your group, and that you're really, really good at functioning in the group, that is more likely to be the source of self-esteem. For people with an independent self-construal, the source of self-esteem is things that make you unique. A common way in the United States to deflect a compliment, to politely and humbly respond to a compliment, is to say, anybody could have done that. It doesn't make you proud of yourself if it's something common to everybody. Marcus's colleague at Stanford, Catherine Kurhan, published a study in 2014. What she reported was Americans have a stronger connection to psychological well-being with their status as they estimate it, their social status as they understand it. So if they are satisfied with their job, with the things they own, with the neighborhood they live in, and they say, it fits me, I love my neighborhood, I live in a house that I picked and I love it, I work at a job that I love, those are associated with higher psychological well-being. But for people with an interdependent self-construal, specifically from Japan, what was more important was objective social status. I work for a company everybody has heard of. I have a job title that impresses other people. My house or my car is a brand of car that is a luxury brand. Other people can see that my sources of status are impressive. Last source of difference is relationships. For people with an interdependent self-construal, relationships are of the utmost importance. And the purpose of a relationship is it gives you an opportunity to benefit the group. The group that you belong to, if you make a contribution, that is something that's a major objective in life. Membership in groups and relationships also define who you are. You are the fun friend. You are the loyal son. You are the caring parent. For people with an independent self-construal, the purpose of relationships is to benefit the self. I have friends because they are how I have fun. I have friends because they help me cope with all the stresses in my life. And they don't define who you are, they confirm your uniqueness. In your relationships, you see how you're different from other people. And some of those differences are positive and some are negative, but you have a clearer sense of who you are when you know how you're not the same as the people around you. All right, that is what the research shows about the difference in how independent and interdependent self-construal, how those influence various things having to do with relationships and communication. That brings us then To what the class is about. What are the Christian influences on the difference? And for me to try to explain that, I am going to explain to you this word. That word is commonly misunderstood, even by people who go to church or another religious service every week. The word worship, the concept of worship, has two parts to it. First, that which you worship is the top priority in your life. It is more important than anything else. And second, worship can be done well or it can be done poorly, and the difference is very simple. Worship is done well when you're not doing it just to get good things. Worship is done poorly when you make something your top priority only because you think it will bring pleasure or reward. Let me give you two examples that have nothing to do with religion. People can and do worship sports teams. People who are fans of sports teams. I bet you know some. That sports team they are a fan of is the top priority in their life. If their team is playing, everything else gets pushed out of the way. Another example of worship, there are a lot of parents in the world who worship their child or their parenthood or both. Being a parent and taking care of their child is the top priority, and anything else has to get out of the way. The second part of the definition, it can be done well or it can be done poorly. You might know someone who cheers for a sports team, but only when they're winning. And we have names for fans like that. In English, we call them fair weather fans. The real fans, they cheer for the team. They are loyal to the team, even when the team is losing. When it comes to parenthood, there are people who say, I feel lonely, I feel sad, so I'll have a baby. Because the baby will love me, and the baby will do cute things, and then I'll be happy. And that's foolish. If you become a parent, you have to expect that baby is going to throw tantrums, that baby is going to grow into a teenager, that baby is going to have days when they say they hate you. And if you're going to be a decent parent, you have to do a good job of parenting even on those days. So those are both examples for the concept of worship. Now, for Christians and for adherents of a lot of religions, the word worship just means God is the top priority, and everything else has to get out of the way. Now, in none of these cases are we saying you get rid of everything else. When you're a parent, you don't give up everything. It's just everything else has to serve or at least not interfere with the well-being of your child. If you worship your team, you don't quit your job and burn your house down. It's just everything else has to either serve or not get in the way of you being a fan. And people who worship God, they don't get rid of everything else. I still showed up to work today. But everything you do either serves or at least doesn't interfere with your top priority. The second part of the definition, you don't just do it to bring you rewards or good things. And there are people who will get interested in religion and they'll say, if I convert and I start praying, reading my Bible, doing all this religious stuff, will I get rich? Will I never get sick? Will I be kept safe? And the answer to that is, if that's why you're doing it, that's not worship done properly, that's worship done poorly. That's you trying to bargain and have a transactional relationship. That's not really worshiping. There is, actually, let me make sure I don't skip anything here. One detail that it's the reason I'm talking about this today. rooting for a sports team, being a parent. Do you notice how central those are to people's identity? The other things, some other examples of things you might worship. I have known people who worship their career. They want to be a business owner. They want to be an actor or a professional musician. And that is what they worship. It's their top priority. It's also their identity. Whatever you have that you worship, that is going to make a big difference in how you present yourself to the world. A famous philosopher from a century past named Soren Kierkegaard, one of the earliest writers and thinkers about existentialism, but also a Christian, he had a definition of sin. And his definition was, sin is building your identity on anything besides God. So, my faith means that God is my top priority, and it also means God could take anything away from me. I have a Fulbright grant. I am a college professor. Those could go away tomorrow because my top priority is to do what I see as my duty to follow in obedience to what God expects of me. And that brings me to the other word that I want to define for you, and that is this. And that's a word that a lot of people misunderstand. Even people who show up to religious services every week, you mention glory, and they think something like that. They think it basically means shiny light, magic light that comes off God. It looks like something out of a movie. Actually, anywhere in the Bible that the word glory shows up, it is a translation of a Hebrew word, kavod. And kavod has kind of a surprising meaning. It means that. That's what glory means. Christians love to talk about their objective is to give glory to God, but if that's what glory means, that's kind of weird. You just want to make God heavy? What, like, so he's hard to steal? What does it mean to give weight to God? Here's how I would describe it. Every year at the Academy Awards, someone gets handed their Oscar. And over the years, in their acceptance speech, very many of them have said, I've dreamed of this, but I didn't know how heavy it would be. You may, in your life, have saved up money for years to buy something, and you've imagined what it would be like when you had it, and the moment when you're holding it and you feel the weight of it is when it becomes real. A very common experience around the world is that people grow up thinking about becoming parents. And then there is that moment they hold their child for the first time, and they feel the weight of the child. Weight, in this sense, in that definition, people have an abstract concept, a daydream of who God is. When the Bible talks about give glory to God, do you remember we talked at the first class meeting when we talked about the basics? And we said sin separates us from God. And a point I made that day is that the separation, it's not that God can't reach us, because God is not limited by distance. It's that we are not aware of God's presence. And that's for our protection. What I said last week was the Bible tells the story of some occasions when people were aware of God's presence and they were terrified. Not because God seemed violent or dangerous, but because God seemed so good that it seemed inescapable, inevitable, that he was going to destroy them and that he should. So how does that bring us to this? My purpose, a Christian's purpose, a basic Christian teaching, is that we should glorify God by giving God wait. What the Bible teaches that Christians do is they make God real without a direct experience of God, which would be terrifying. But you make God real through your behavior. You make God real through your words. You make God real through talking about what a difference God has made in your own life. That is where I lost my train of thought. That is the basic Christian teaching about what worship looks like and about what the objective is for anyone who is a Christian. That is their identity and their purpose in the world, and that God might move them to different situations. If you're a parent and you have a child, maybe you get a dog and you realize your child is allergic to the dog, so you get rid of the dog. Maybe you get a job and you realize the job makes you work long hours, so you change jobs. Maybe you live in a neighborhood and there aren't good parks nearby, so you move to a different neighborhood. Do you notice the constant? What this is saying is, for a Christian, your identity, everything else in your life is movable. But this one thing is not. And that has profound implications for self-construal. In particular, I mentioned this at the first class meeting. I'm going to do it for the first time. I have a passage from the Bible. I did not do a sound check, so we're about to see if the equipment is going to support me. Possibly I should make sure that the volume is turned up on this. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Oh, man. Let's see if I can get back to it. Boom. That's fine. That's not what I want. Dude, nope. Oh, come on. There we are now. How do I get to HDMI? Ooh. HDMI is input 3. I wonder how I get. Oh, that's how I do it. Let's see if you'll do that. You gonna do it? I have a saying that my students are very familiar with. It's that technology hates you and wants to destroy you. Let's see if this one will do it. I know I'm on the HDMI cable, so one of these it says HDMI. Oh, look at that. The technology thought it was in charge. I showed it. I'm not touching the remote again. I hope that the volume works. Actually, maybe I am. Because that's for, I don't know which of those is. We will see. Okay. If this works, this is out of the Bible. And if this works, this is Jesus preaching to the crowd. Okay, that's way too low to hear. You can have a second while I look over here and see if there is a manual. Oh, I think there is. Well, I'm afraid to touch it, though. Actually, I think it's the plus and the minus. Let me do that real quick. Here we go. I was just looking at the wrong control. Put that about halfway and hope I don't blow your ears out. Okay, take 2.
2羽のスズメは一夜作業で売られているではありませんか。そんなスズメの1羽でさえ、あなた方の父の許しなしに地に落ちることはありません。あなた方の髪の毛さえもすべて数えられています。ですから恐れてはいけません。あなた方は多くのスズメよりも価値があるのです。ですから誰でも人々の前で私を認めるなら、私も天におられる私の父の前でその人を認めます。しかし、人々の前で私を知らないという者は、私も天におられる私の父の前でその人を知らないと言います。私が来たのは地上に平和をもたらすためだと思ってはいけません。 私は平和ではなく剣をもたらすために来ました。私は人をその父に、娘をその母に、嫁をその姑に逆らわせるために来たのです。そのようにして家の者たちがその人の敵となるのです。私よりも父や母を愛する者は私にふさわしいものではありません。私よりも息子や娘を愛する者は私にふさわしいものではありません。
So, it is possible that some folks in here may not have the Japanese, as I certainly don't, to follow that in Japanese. That's the passage. It's from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 10, verses 29 to 37. It's possible you have not navigated a Bible before. That's okay too. If you would like to read it in English or in your first language, if you'll email me after class, I can find you the passage and send it to you. But this is what happened. At the beginning of that passage, Jesus pointed out, you can buy 2 sparrows for a tiny, tiny coin, but God keeps track of every single sparrow. Not a single sparrow dies without God noticing. And then Jesus said, you are far more important to God than many, many sparrows. And a big part of teaching, Christian teaching about self-concept, is that the creator and ruler of the universe finds you valuable. And that's where a lot of